Good evening, and welcome to another quiet journey through time. Tonight, we'll drift slowly back to the winter of 1846, to a frozen mountain pass where hope and survival tangled in the snow. Let yourself settle in, breathe deeply, and allow the past to wash over you like a gentle tide. In the winter of that year, a group of hopeful pioneers became trapped high in the Sierra Nevada, where snow buried their wagons, silence replaced prayer, and survival blurred into something unspoken. We'll explore what it meant to hope, to starve, and to quietly endure the endless white. Tonight's story moves slowly, like winter itself, inviting you to drift wherever your mind feels ready. Before we step into this quiet journey through snow and survival, I'd like to ask a small favor. If your heart is ready to wander back in time with me, tap the like button below. Subscribe to Epic Boring History so these late-night passages through forgotten corners can find you again. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, whether you're wrapped in night's stillness or greeting early morning. Now, dim the lights if you can. Maybe let a gentle fan hum for that soothing background sound. Let's settle in together and begin our journey through one of history's most haunting winters. You are somewhere between promise and peril, a faint dot in a long line of wagons stretching west across the plain. You left behind a house that was never really yours, chasing a dream you could barely define. Green valleys, free land, and a sky that promised something like peace. But by autumn, peace is gone. The trail narrows with each passing day. The oxen move slower now, their breath coming in heavy clouds that hang in the cold morning air. Dust has turned to frost, settling on everything, the wagon canvas, your clothes, your hair. Every morning you wake with ice on the canvas above your face. Your fingers are stiff, reluctant to bend. Your breath hangs like mist in the dim light filtering through the wagon cover. The food barrels grow lighter with each passing week. The sky seems to grow heavier, pressing down with grey weight. You eat whatever can be boiled down, stretching small things into meals that barely satisfy. A scrap of bacon becomes a treasure. A cup of cornmeal must feed 4 mouths instead of 2. A sliver of hope that tomorrow will be easier. This costs nothing, but is the hardest thing to maintain. Each day feels the same. Walk, stumble, repair, repeat. You fix the wheels that splinter on rocks hidden beneath the trail dust. You patch the leather yokes that crack and fray in the dry air. You listen to the dull creak of wagons that sound more tired than you feel. The wood groans like something living. The wheels protest each rotation. When the wind picks up, the plains feel endless. They swallow sound, swallow hope, swallow even the memory of towns you passed weeks ago. Distance becomes meaningless when every horizon looks the same. The children complain of hunger. You hush them, not with anger, but with exhaustion that has settled into your bones. There's no time to comfort, only to move forward, always forward. The horizon promises mountains. Beyond them, California, though that word has begun to feel more like myth than destination. You repeat it to yourself like a prayer. By October, the air smells different. Pine and frost sharp and clean in your lungs. The scent carries something else too, a warning, though you don't recognize it yet. The trail steepens into the Sierra Nevada. The change is gradual at first, then suddenly dramatic. The flat plains give way to rising ground that tests the oxen with every step. The animals sink deeper into the snow with each labored step. Their eyes roll white with exhaustion. Their ribs show through their hides despite the thickness of their winter coats. You light fires that smoke but never warm. The wood is green, still full of sap, and it hisses and spits when flames touch it. Even your thoughts grow heavy, like the air itself has weight. At night, you hear others in nearby camps. Low murmurs drift across the darkness. Prayers fade into coughing that echoes in the cold. Someone's ox died in the snow and had to be abandoned. The carcass lies where it fell, already dusted with fresh snow. Someone's wagon wheel broke and was left behind, a wooden ghost on the trail. You learn the rhythm of quiet suffering. Every sound becomes a language of waiting. The crackle of fire speaks of warmth you can't quite reach. The sigh of exhausted bodies tells of sleep that won't come easy. The groan of snow settling on branches whispers of the weight building above. Time stretches and compresses until you can't remember if you've been traveling for months or years. You start to forget the idea of California. The dream that pulled you from your home grows dim. The world has shrunk to the space between your numb hands and the cold earth below them. You just keep walking. You hope the next ridge brings warmth. You know deep down it doesn't, but you walk anyway, because stopping means accepting what you're not ready to accept. The snow begins in earnest one October morning. It falls soft and silent at first, almost pretty. Within hours, it's falling faster than you can walk through it. The wagons slow, then stop. Someone suggests making camp until it passes. Everyone agrees because there's no other choice when you can't see 5 feet ahead. But the snow doesn't pass. It falls through that afternoon, accumulating in drifts against the wagon wheels. It falls through the night, muffling all sound except its own soft whisper. It falls through the next morning, and the morning after that. The drifts rise past your knees, then your waist, then the wagon wheels themselves. The world transforms into something unrecognizable. The pass ahead, the one that would lead you down into California's warmth, becomes impossible to see. The mountains disappear behind curtains of white. The world turns white and stays that way. Somewhere in that whiteness, hope begins its slow, quiet retreat, not all at once, but like water draining from a basin, gradually, then suddenly all at once. And you don't notice until it's too late to catch it. You gather with others to discuss options. The meeting happens in the lee of a wagon, everyone hunched against the wind. Some want to push forward, arguing that California can't be more than a few days' journey. Others suggest waiting for the weather to clear. They point to the animals too weak now to pull through deep snow. A few speak of turning back, though their voices are quiet and no one responds. In the end, you do what people have always done when trapped between impossible choices. You build shelter from what you can find. You light fires that barely warm. You wait, because waiting is the only option left when all others have closed like doors. The rhythm of your days becomes even simpler now. Wake, gather wood, melt snow for water, sleep. The children grow quieter with each passing week. Their complaints cease. Their questions stop. They simply exist, watching with large eyes that seem to understand more than they should. The adults speak less, their conversations reduced to practical matters. How much flour remains in the barrel? Whose turn is it to tend the fire through the night? Whether the snow will ever stop? It doesn't stop. Day after day, snow falls. Sometimes heavy, sometimes light, but always present. The world becomes a study in white. White ground, white sky, white air filled with falling flakes. Inside the rough cabins built from green pine, the air is thick with smoke and damp. The logs were cut hastily, poorly fitted. The roofs leak melted snow that freezes again at night, creating icicles that hang like teeth. Your clothes never dry. You wear dampness like a second skin. Your hands never stop aching. The joints swollen and painful. The gnawing in your stomach becomes a constant companion. You almost stop noticing it. The way you stop noticing the sound of wind after it's blown for days. It becomes part of your baseline existence. You begin to understand that comfort is not a right, but a luxury. That warmth is earned, not given. That the human body can endure far more than you ever imagined, and simultaneously far less than you hoped. The ox hides that once covered the roofs become food when nothing else remains. The decision is made quietly, without ceremony. Someone climbs up and tears down a section, and no one objects. You boil the hide for hours until it softens into something almost edible. The texture is wrong, neither meat nor leather, but something in between. The taste is beyond description, but it fills the stomach, at least temporarily. Tree bark is scraped from the pines and ground into powder. You mix it with melted snow and try not to think about what you're consuming. Bones are cracked for their marrow, every fragment examined for potential nutrition. Every scrap, every fragment, everything that might sustain life is considered, discussed, consumed. Survival strips away everything but the essential: dignity, privacy, preference. All these luxury concepts fade like smoke. You think of the people you left behind, the ones who warned you not to go, who said the journey was foolish. You think of their faces, their voices, their comfortable homes. You think of the California you imagined, warm and golden and full of promise, orchards heavy with fruit, fields green and endless. You think of anything except where you are right now. Time becomes strange in the cabin. Days blur together without distinction. The dim light through the smoke makes every hour look the same. Is it morning or afternoon? Tuesday or Saturday? December or January? You lose track, and after a while, you stop trying to keep track because the effort seems pointless. The snow outside reaches the roofline, then rises past it. You have to dig a tunnel to exit the cabin for firewood. The world becomes a network of tunnels and caves, the cabin a tomb of wood and ice. And still, you wait. Because what else is there to do? Leaving means certain death in the snow. Staying means slow death by starvation. You choose the slower death because it allows for the possibility of rescue. Some speak of trying to walk out to cross the pass on foot. The idea is discussed in low voices. The strongest among you volunteer, young men and women who still have hope, or at least the energy to pretend. You watch them leave one December morning. Their figures disappear into the white within minutes. You wonder if you'll ever see them again, though you try not to show that doubt to the children. Inside, those who remain develop routines to preserve sanity. Someone tells stories, the same ones repeated until everyone knows them by heart. Someone else sings hymns, their voice thin and trembling, but persistent. Someone tends the fire with the devotion of a priest at an altar. The fire is everything: warmth, light, hope, a focus for attention. Without it, there's only cold and darkness and the sound of breathing. You notice how the cold changes people. Some grow quieter, retreating inward to places where others can't follow. Others become irritable, snapping at small things, a misplaced cup, someone coughing too loud. A few maintain an eerie calm, as if they've already made peace with whatever comes next. They move through the cabin like ghosts, present, but not quite there. You wonder which response is healthier, if any of them are. The children stop asking when you'll reach California. They stop asking about food beyond the basic, "Is there anything?" They simply exist, conserving energy by moving as little as possible. Their bodies grow thinner beneath layers of worn clothing. Cheekbones emerge where there were once round cheeks. Arms become stick-thin, easily circled by an adult's thumb and finger. You realize slowly that this is what survival looks like. Not heroic or noble, but mundane and grinding. A series of small defeats accepted one after another, hour after frozen hour, day after endless day. When you sleep, you dream of warmth. Not California necessarily, but simple things, a hot meal, dry clothes, a room without smoke. These dreams feel more real than waking. You wake disappointed to find yourself still in the cold. For a moment, the dream lingers, and reality seems like the nightmare. Then full consciousness returns and you remember where you are. The silence of the snow is its own kind of noise. It muffles everything, voices, thoughts, hope itself. You could scream and the snow would swallow it, leaving no echo, no proof you'd made a sound at all. You understand now why others speak of winter with such reverence. It's not just a season, but a test, one that most people never face this purely. And you're not sure if you're passing or failing, only that you're still here. Your fingers have lost feeling in the tips. The skin is white and waxy looking. Your toes ache constantly, a deep pain that radiates up through your feet and into your calves. Your skin is dry and cracked despite the dampness. Your lips split and bleed, the wounds healing slowly in the cold. These small pains become background noise, less important than the larger pain of simply being trapped. The worst part isn't the cold or the hunger, it's the waiting. The not knowing if anyone will come, if the snow will ever melt, if this white prison will ever release you. It's the slow erosion of certainty about anything at all. You start to question whether California even exists, whether the people who left made it through, whether anyone remembers you're here. You think about the word pioneer and realize how empty it sounds. There's nothing heroic about freezing slowly, nothing noble about watching your supplies dwindle, nothing brave about hoping someone remembers you exist. There's only the dull ache of endurance, the stubborn refusal to give up even when giving up would be easier. The animal determination to keep breathing, keep moving, keep existing. At night you hear the wind howling over the snow, a sound like loneliness made audible. You hear the fire crackling, a sound like time burning away. You hear others breathing, a reminder that you're not alone in this, though sometimes it feels that way. The cabin walls seem to close in as the weeks pass. The space that once felt adequate now feels cramped and suffocating. Every surface is familiar to the point of hatred, but there's nowhere else to go, nothing else to do but stay and wait and hope. So you stay, you wait, and you try to hold on to hope even as it slips through your fingers like smoke. You catch yourself bargaining with forces you don't believe in. If we survive this, I'll never complain about small discomforts again. If spring comes, I'll be grateful for every warm day. If someone rescues us, I'll never take safety for granted. But spring doesn't come. No one arrives. The snow continues falling, indifferent to your prayers or promises. And you continue waiting because that's all that's left to do. The days blend into weeks, the weeks into months. Time loses meaning. You mark its passage not by calendar, but by how much weaker you've become, how much thinner the children look, how low the last barrel of anything resembling food has gotten. And through it all, the snow keeps falling, patient, persistent, indifferent, building its white walls higher and higher, sealing you in more completely with each storm. The mountains have you now, and they're not letting go. There were nearly 90 of them when they set out, families, children, newlyweds, elderly couples, all traveling under the wide promise of manifest destiny. They were told it would take 4 months to reach California, a journey of hope and reinvention. It took them 8 months, and not all of them completed it. You hear their names whispered still, even after all these years. George Donner, a gentle farmer from Illinois with his wife Tamsin, a school teacher known for her intelligence and grace. James Reed, a businessman from Springfield with a family he loved fiercely, sometimes too fiercely. Margaret Reed, his wife, quiet but resilient in ways no one yet understood. The Graves family, Franklin and Elizabeth with their 9 children. The Breens, devout Irish Catholics who would pray their way through the darkness. Mary Graves, Barely more than a girl, but strong enough to outlast most. The Murphys, the Eddies, the Fosdicks, ordinary names belonging to ordinary people. They began as neighbors on the road west, sharing flour and firelight and dreams of better days. But as the snows closed in around Truckee Lake, something gentler began to die. Hope, perhaps, that most fragile of human possessions. Or innocence, the belief that goodness alone could overcome circumstance. Or maybe it was the illusion that willpower alone could overcome nature's indifference. The mountains didn't care about determination. The snow didn't respect courage. The trouble began long before the snow, though no one recognized it at the time. The party had taken a shortcut recommended by a guidebook writer named Lansford Hastings, a man who'd never actually traveled the route himself but described it with the confidence of someone selling dreams. The Hastings Cut-Off, it was called, promising to save weeks off the journey, 200 miles shorter on paper, which meant earlier arrival in California, which meant better land claims, more time to build before winter. Instead, it added weeks to their journey. The cut-off led through the Wasatch Mountains, where they spent days hacking a path through dense brush and timber. Then across the Great Salt Lake Desert, where the earth itself seemed hostile to life. Through the Utah desert, the wagons struggled across salt flats that stretched to the horizon, white and cracked and impossibly hot, reflecting sunlight until their eyes ached. The oxen's hooves sank into the crust, and pulling the wagons became torture. Water barrels ran dry faster than anticipated. The heat was relentless, merciless. Oxen collapsed and died where they stood, their bodies left behind to bake in the sun. Tempers flared under the brutal conditions. Arguments broke out over leadership, over routes, over who was consuming more than their share of dwindling supplies. The social bonds that had held the party together began to fray. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada, they were already behind schedule, already exhausted, already running low on everything they needed to survive: food, strength, patience, hope. James Reed, proud and protective of his family, got into an argument with another teamster named John Snyder. The confrontation happened on a steep section of trail where wagons struggled to climb. Snyder was beating Reed's oxen, and Reed intervened. Words escalated to shoving. Snyder raised his whip and struck Reed's wife Margaret across the head. Reed responded instinctively, his knife finding flesh before thought could intervene. The man died days later from the wound. The party held a trial of sorts and banished Reed, sending him away on horseback without provisions. His family stayed behind, waiting for him to find help and return, trusting in his promise that he would. Margaret was left to manage their children alone. Virginia, the eldest at 13, tried to be brave. Patty and James Jr. and baby Thomas, all depending on their mother now. Margaret had always been strong, but this would test her in ways she couldn't imagine. George Donner, the party's informal leader, injured his hand trying to repair a wagon axle. A simple accident. The chisel slipped, cutting deep into the flesh between his thumb and forefinger. The wound wouldn't heal properly in the cold and dirt. It festered quietly beneath dirty bandages. He never complained, but you could see the pain in how he moved, how he grew quieter as the days passed, conserving energy that was draining away through that small wound. Tamsen Donner watched her husband weaken and said nothing. What was there to say? They were committed now, too far to turn back. She cared for him as best she could while managing their 5 daughters and helping other families. When the first major snowstorm hit in late October, it fell fast and heavy. The pass was only a few miles ahead, so close they could almost taste California. But those few miles might as well have been 1,000. They were trapped at an altitude where winter arrives early and stays late, where snow measures in feet rather than inches, accumulating faster than it can melt. They built cabins from whatever timber they could find, rough pine logs, still wet with sap, and huddled together against the cold. The Breen family claimed an existing cabin left by earlier emigrants. The Reeds and Eddies built another nearby. The Donners, camped 6 miles behind, constructed crude shelters at what would become known as Alder Creek. Inside those cabins, days began to blur into one another. There was little left to eat once the remaining oxen were slaughtered. The meat was rationed carefully, stretched as far as possible, but mathematics was cruel. Too many mouths, too little food. Ox hides were boiled into a gelatinous soup that barely qualified as food. The process took hours, the hide bubbling in water until it softened. The result was translucent and tasteless, but filled stomachs temporarily. Bones were cracked and sucked for marrow. Even the smallest bones were saved, boiled repeatedly, until they gave up whatever nutrients they contained. Nothing was wasted because waste meant death. Anything that might provide sustenance was considered, consumed, or set aside for later. The leather of boots and belts, twigs and bark, boiled into bitter tea. Even the mice that occasionally appeared in the cabins were caught and eaten. The children grew quiet in that particular way that frightens adults, not peaceful but withdrawn, conserving energy for survival. Their eyes grew large in thinning faces, watching everything with an intensity that seemed too old for their years. The men stopped talking about California, about the farms they would build, or the opportunities that awaited. Those conversations belonged to a different time, a different group of people. Now they talked only about today, about survival measured in hours. Time itself became the enemy. Each day another mountain to climb, each hour another small defeat to absorb. The present stretched endlessly while the future shrank to nothing. James Reed, who had made it to California before the snows came, gathered a rescue party as soon as he could. He arrived at Sutter's Fort with wild stories of the party trapped in the mountains. He begged for help, for supplies, for horses. But the Sierra Nevada in winter shows no mercy to good intentions. The passes were blocked, the snow too deep for horses or mules. Even experienced mountain men hesitated to attempt a rescue in such conditions. He could only wait and worry, knowing his family was trapped somewhere in that vast whiteness, imagining their suffering, feeling the helplessness of distance and weather. Weeks turned into months at the lake. The party divided their time between gathering firewood and rationing food. The firewood became harder to find as they cleared the area around the cabins, having to venture farther in deep snow. The first group who tried to walk out, 15 people who called themselves the Forlorn Hope, left in mid-December. 10 men and 5 women, the strongest among them, carrying 6 days of rations for a journey they hoped would take 6 days. They fashioned crude snowshoes from oxbow wood and rawhide. The shoes were clumsy and painful to wear, but they kept the wearers from sinking completely into the deep snow. They left early one morning, while others watched from the cabin doors. They stumbled through the snow on those improvised snowshoes, each step a negotiation with exhaustion. The mountains rose around them, beautiful and deadly. The snow reflected sunlight so brightly it hurt to look at, causing snow blindness in several travelers. They had no compass, no map, only hope that walking west would eventually lead downhill. The terrain was disorienting. Every ridge looked the same, every valley indistinguishable from the last. They quickly became lost. When their food ran out after 6 days, they still saw nothing but mountains and snow. They'd traveled perhaps 30 miles, a fraction of what they needed. The realization settled over them like the snow itself, slow, cold, suffocating. When they'd eaten everything, including their leather shoes, they faced choices no human should have to face. They drew lots to determine who would sacrifice themselves for the others. But when the lot fell to a young man, no one could bring themselves to follow through. Then nature made the choice for them. A storm hit, and 4 people died from exposure. The survivors huddled together, and when morning came, they faced the terrible mathematics of survival. 7 people remained alive with no food and many miles to go. What they did has been whispered about for generations. The survivors themselves rarely spoke of it directly, using euphemisms and careful language. They did what they had to do, they said. They did what was necessary. Hunger changes what a person sees in another's eyes, changes what seems possible or impossible, moral or immoral. It reduces life to its most basic calculation, survive or don't. They cut flesh from the dead with the kind of mechanical efficiency that comes when horror becomes routine. They dried it over fires, trying to make it last. They didn't speak of it, didn't acknowledge what they were doing beyond the practical necessities. Some refused to participate, choosing to die rather than cross that line. Others found that survival instinct overpowered moral certainty. Years later, they would struggle to reconcile what they'd done with who they thought they were. The forlorn hope staggered on. More died as they walked. The survivors, growing weaker, continued to consume the dead. It was a cycle that seemed endless, death feeding life, feeding death. Salvador and Luis, 2 Native American guides who'd been helping the party, grew frightened of their companions. They ran off into the snow, preferring to take their chances alone. Days later, the remaining survivors found them nearly dead from exposure and hunger. What happened next is disputed. Some accounts say the men were already dead when found. Others suggest something darker. The truth died with the people involved, leaving only ambiguity and discomfort. After 33 days in the snow, 7 members of the Forlorn Hope finally stumbled into a Native American village in the foothills. They were barely human, skeletal, frostbitten, traumatized beyond speech. The villagers fed them carefully, knowing that too much food, too quickly, could kill. Back at the lake, those who'd stayed behind waited in the cold, dark cabins. They didn't know if the Forlorn Hope had made it through. They didn't know if anyone would ever come for them. Patrick Breen kept a diary, his entries growing shorter as weakness set in. "Still snowing," he wrote again and again. No sign of relief. His faith sustained him when nothing else could. The Reeds ran out of food entirely by mid-January. Margaret and her children survived on ox hides and boiled bones. Virginia, the teenager, helped care for her younger siblings while her mother grew weaker. At Alder Creek, George Donner's hand had become seriously infected. The wound that had seemed minor months ago was now killing him slowly. Tamsin cared for him while managing their children and trying to keep hope alive. When the first rescue party finally arrived in mid-February, they brought food but not enough to take everyone out at once. They had to make choices about who was strong enough to attempt the journey over the pass. The rescuers were shocked by what they found. The cabins partially buried in snow, barely visible above the drifts. The smell that hit them when they opened the doors, smoke, unwashed bodies, and something worse they couldn't identify. Inside, hollow-eyed survivors sat in silence. Some were too weak to feel relief. Others wept. Children stared with that too-old expression that trauma brings. The rescuers distributed food carefully. Too much too fast could kill someone in an advanced state of starvation. They built up the fires, assessed who could travel, and prepared for the difficult journey back. They could take only the strongest, those who could walk on their own. The children would be prioritized. Then women. Then men, if space allowed. Margaret Reed and her children were among those chosen for the first rescue. Virginia helped carry her little brother. Patty, weak but determined, walked on her own. They left behind neighbors and friends, not knowing if they'd ever see them again. The journey over the pass was brutal. Snow continued falling. The children struggled in the deep powder, even with the trail broken. Several times, it seemed they wouldn't make it. But Margaret Reed possessed a strength that starvation couldn't quite eliminate. She encouraged, she carried, she pushed when pushing was needed. Her children survived because she willed it so. George Donner was too weak to leave. The infection had spread up his arm and he was feverish, delirious. Tamsin refused to abandon him, sending their children ahead with rescuers while she stayed behind. The rescuers tried to convince her to leave. Her husband was dying. Anyone could see it. But she wouldn't go. Love or duty or stubbornness kept her by his side. A second rescue party arrived in early March. They found more survivors, more death, more evidence of what people had done to survive. The rescuers were hardened mountain men, but even they were shaken. At Alder Creek, they found George Donner had died. Tamsin was still alive, but had made the decision to stay. She sent letters with the rescuers, messages for her children. Then she disappeared into the snow, her fate a mystery that remains unsolved. Some say she tried to walk out alone and died in a storm. Others suggest she stayed at the camp and succumbed to exposure or starvation. Her body was never found. She simply vanished, leaving only questions. James Reed, who'd been banished months earlier, was part of the second rescue attempt. He finally reunited with his family in late March after 3 separate rescue efforts. They had survived, though barely. His wife Margaret had kept their children alive through sheer determination and the kindness of others who shared what little they had. Virginia had helped care for her siblings, growing up in those frozen months more than most people do in years. By the time the fourth and final rescue party arrived in late April, the snow was finally beginning to melt. They found only a handful of survivors left at the camps, the weakest who'd been unable to travel earlier. They also found evidence of what had sustained some of those survivors through the long months. The rescuers didn't discuss it in detail, but their reports mentioned things that made clear what had happened. The horror was implicit, undeniable. Of the 87 who'd been trapped at the lake and Alder Creek, only 48 reached California alive. The others died of starvation, exposure, infection, or simply gave up when endurance ran out. The mathematics of tragedy are always precise. 39 souls lost to snow and hunger and despair. Even in the soft warmth of spring, those who lived carried the sound of that winter forever. The scraping wind that never stopped, the cracking ice on the lake, the quiet hunger that could never really fade. The survivors rarely spoke of their ordeal in detail. Some wrote brief accounts, carefully worded and emotionally distant. Patrick Breen's diary, with its simple entries, became one of the few primary sources. Others refused to discuss it at all, as if silence could erase what had happened, as if not speaking of it made it less real. But the stories leaked out anyway, spreading across the country in newspapers and letters, growing more lurid with each retelling, more focused on the sensational aspects than the human ones. The question everyone wanted answered was the one nobody wanted to ask directly. What happened when there was no food left? What did people do when the only choice was between dying and doing the unthinkable? The truth was complicated, nuanced, and deeply human. Some resorted to cannibalism after death had already claimed their companions. The distinction mattered to them. They didn't kill, they only survived. Others refused absolutely, choosing to die rather than cross that line. Their choice was equally human, equally valid. There was no single response, no universal breaking point. Some showed extraordinary compassion in the worst circumstances, sharing their last morsels with children who weren't their own, giving up their places on rescue parties for someone weaker, maintaining their humanity when it would have been easier to abandon it. Others hoarded and schemed, looked out only for themselves and their immediate family. made decisions that saved them but cost others. Survival brings out truth, both beautiful and ugly. Most simply tried to survive as best they could, making impossible choices in the absence of good options, living with guilt and trauma and memories that would never quite fade. What strikes you most, learning their stories, is how ordinary they were before this happened. They weren't adventurers or risk-seekers or people accustomed to hardship. They were farmers, merchants, mothers, fathers, people just like anyone else, hoping for a better life in a new place. The only thing that separated them from thousands of other successful pioneers was timing and a few bad decisions. The choice of the Hastings cutoff, the delays in crossing the Wasatch, the argument that led to Reed's banishment, each small decision compounding into catastrophe. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a mirror of a new country, its promise, its cruelty, and the cost of expansion. The same manifest destiny that beckoned people westward cared nothing for their survival. The land didn't care about dreams or determination. It simply was indifferent to human suffering or hope. The mountains would be there long after the last human voice fell silent. In the years that followed, the story of the Donner Party became a cautionary tale. Don't take shortcuts, don't trust unproven routes, don't leave late in the season. Practical lessons written in blood and snow. But the deeper lesson was harder to articulate. That civilization is thinner than we imagine. That survival can strip away everything we think defines our humanity. That we're all capable of more than we believe, both heroic and horrible. The survivors went on to live full lives, most of them. They married, had more children, built businesses, and integrated into California society. They became farmers and merchants and ordinary citizens, but they never forgot that winter, never fully escaped it. It lived in their dreams, in their silences, in the way they never quite relaxed when winter came around each year. If you visit the Sierra Nevada now, there's a calm that belies what once happened there. Truckee Lake, now called Donner Lake, sits beneath clear alpine skies, its surface reflecting mountains and clouds with perfect serenity. The air is clean and pine-scented, sharp in your lungs in a way that feels wholesome rather than threatening. The water changes color with the seasons, deep blue in summer, gray-green in autumn, crystalline in the moments before it freezes. The surrounding peaks rise with geological indifference, their granite faces carved by ancient glaciers, their slopes covered in stands of pine and fir. Everything about the place suggests permanence, a landscape that existed long before humans arrived and will exist long after they're gone. The trees whisper softly in the breeze. Tourists photograph the scenery, hikers traverse the trails, and boats glide across the water in summer. It's beautiful in the way mountain lakes are beautiful. Timeless, pristine, indifferent. Children skip stones across the surface in summer, watching them dance before sinking into depths that hold more than water. Families spread blankets on the shore for picnics, never thinking about what the ground beneath them has witnessed. The normalcy of it all, the laughter, the ease, the casual recreation, creates a strange dissonance for those who know the history. Yet beneath that beauty, the land remembers. It holds the memory in its soil, in the patterns of its forest growth, in the strange quiet that sometimes settles over certain spots. History isn't always visible, but it's always present, waiting to be uncovered by those who know where to look. The forest floor, covered in pine needles and decomposing leaves, conceals layers of earlier forests, earlier winters, earlier suffering. Dig down through the organic matter and you reach the level where history becomes archaeology, where human presence leaves traces more permanent than memory, but less complete than we'd like. Archaeologists have traced the outlines of the cabins over the years, finding charred timbers partially preserved in the cold soil, discovering post holes and foundation stones that mark where walls once stood. The excavations proceed slowly, methodically, with the care due to sites where tragedy occurred. Every shovelful of earth is screened for artifacts, every anomaly in the soil investigated. The work requires patience and respect and understanding that you're disturbing not just earth, but the physical remnants of human suffering. They've uncovered bones of oxen, scattered and gnawed, telling the story of desperation. The pattern of cut marks on the bones reveals how thoroughly every scrap was utilized. Nothing was wasted when waste meant death. The bones show evidence of having been broken open for marrow, boiled repeatedly until they crumbled, gnawed until nothing remained but splinters. Some were burned, perhaps for fuel after everything else burnable had been consumed. Others show weathering patterns consistent with lying in snow for months, preserved by cold until rescue came or death claimed the last survivors. The human traces are quieter but no less telling. Buttons, dozens of them scattered in areas where clothing must have been abandoned or discarded. Fragments of cloth preserved by accident in the dry cold beneath the snow layer. Each button tells a small story. Brass buttons from a man's coat, pewter buttons from children's clothing, bone buttons from a woman's dress. They're corroded and tarnished, but their presence marks where people lived, where they died, where they shed layers of clothing too heavy to wear or too damaged to repair. The concentration of buttons in certain areas suggests where bodies lay, clothing rotting away to leave only these small metallic witnesses. Children's toys carved from wood, a small horse, a doll, a whistle. These artifacts tell the story of families trying to maintain normalcy, of parents attempting to keep their children's spirits up, even as conditions deteriorated. The workmanship on these toys varies. Some are crude, carved quickly with whatever tools were available, while others show remarkable detail and care. A father whittling by firelight, using precious energy to create something that might make his daughter smile. A mother fashioning a doll from scraps of cloth and wood, trying to preserve childhood in a place where childhood was ending far too soon. Coins are found occasionally, corroded but identifiable. Money became meaningless in the mountains, unable to purchase what didn't exist. The coins were kept out of habit, then lost or abandoned when survival made such concerns trivial. There are gold coins, silver coins, copper pennies, denominations that once meant the difference between comfort and hardship. In the cabins, they meant nothing. You couldn't buy firewood that didn't exist, couldn't purchase food that no one had. Wealth became abstract, a concept from the world below that had no currency in the mountains. Glass beads, the kind used for jewelry or decoration, a woman's possession perhaps, a small luxury carried from home, eventually deemed too heavy or too painful, a reminder of the life left behind. These beads are often found scattered, as if a necklace broke and no one had the energy or inclination to gather the pieces. They're beautiful still, cobalt blue, emerald green, ruby red, colors that must have seemed surreal against the endless white of snow. They represent vanity, hope, the belief that there would be a future where such things mattered again. These artifacts tell the story of waiting, of cold, of people who still hoped even when hope was gone. They maintained routines, kept possessions, clung to the markers of civilization, even as civilization itself seemed very far away. The archaeological record shows patterns of daily life persisting even as conditions worsened. Remains of cooking fires, though there was less and less to cook. Arrangements of stones that might have been seats or work surfaces, suggesting people still tried to organize their living spaces. Evidence of repairs to the cabins, logs added to walls, gaps chinked with whatever material was available, showing that even in despair, people worked to improve their chances. But not everything is known. Some diaries vanished, either lost in the snow or destroyed intentionally by survivors who wanted no record of what they'd witnessed. What was too painful to preserve? What truths were buried deliberately? We know that several members of the party kept journals during the journey and the entrapment. Patrick Breen's diary survives, a stark record of weather and death written in increasingly shaky handwriting. But others are lost. Tamsin Donner's journals, which reportedly contain detailed observations of the journey, disappeared after her death. James Reed's earliest entries from the mountain ordeal are missing, with only his later reminiscences surviving. Some accounts contradict each other, memories warped by trauma and time. Different survivors remembered the same events differently. Who's telling the truth? Are any of them? Or does trauma rewrite memory until truth becomes fluid? One survivor might remember a rescue arriving on a Tuesday, another insists it was Thursday. One recalls a conversation that another swears never happened. These aren't deliberate lies, but the way traumatized minds protect themselves, reshaping events, softening horrors, creating versions of the past that are survivable to remember. There are survivors who never told their full story. They gave brief statements to newspapers, then refused further interviews. They took their secrets to graves far from those mountain passes, leaving gaps in the historical record that can never be filled. Some moved to remote areas where no one knew their history, living out their lives in deliberate anonymity. Others changed their names, started over, built new identities that had nothing to do with those months in the mountains. The few who did speak publicly often gave sanitized versions, mentioning cold and hunger, but skipping over the worst details, the moments that would have made them monsters in the eyes of their listeners. Even the rescuers spoke in half-truths when they returned to civilization. They described conditions as indescribable and left it at that. Some wrote detailed reports but couldn't bring themselves to include certain facts, leaving frustrating blanks where the most difficult truths should be. The rescuers' accounts often use passive voice when describing the worst discoveries. Bodies were found in various states rather than describing what those states actually were. Evidence suggested extreme measures had been taken rather than stating plainly what had occurred. Their language reveals their discomfort, their inability to process what they'd witnessed, even as they tried to document it. The question of cannibalism has obsessed historians and the public alike for nearly 2 centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests it occurred. Bones showing distinctive cut marks and breakage patterns consistent with butchering. The marks are unmistakable to trained eyes, telling stories their owners never wanted told. Forensic analysis of bones recovered from the site shows specific patterns. Cut marks at joints where meat would be removed. Fracture patterns consistent with breaking bones to extract marrow. Burn patterns on some remains, suggesting they were cooked. These aren't natural post-mortem changes, but deliberate human actions, the physical evidence of choices made in extremity. But the exact circumstances remain murky. Who participated? Who refused? How were decisions made? Who died naturally and who might have been hastened along? The answers died with most of the people involved. The silences in the historical record are as telling as what was said. Certain survivors are never mentioned in connection with the worst practices. Others are consistently implied to have participated, though never directly accused. The social dynamics of who was blamed and who was protected likely had as much to do with class, gender, and social standing as with actual actions. Some historians argue it was pure survival, a last resort taken only after all other options were exhausted. They point to the timeline, to the documented consumption of ox hides and bark and leather, to the fact that some survivors clearly starved to death rather than cross that line. The progression of desperation is documented in the diaries and accounts. First, the cattle were consumed, then the horses and mules, then the dogs, then anything remotely edible, hides, boiled until they became gelatinous enough to swallow, strips of leather from boots and harnesses, bark, stripped from trees and chewed, until it yielded whatever minimal nutrition it held. Only after all of this did the unthinkable become thinkable. Others find evidence of earlier instances than survivors admitted, discrepancies in accounts, suspicious timing, bodies that disappeared too quickly. They suggest desperation arrived sooner than the official narratives claim, that the line between life and death became blurred earlier than anyone wanted to acknowledge. There are timeline problems in some accounts, people mentioned as alive in one diary entry, but whose bodies can't be accounted for in later ones. Estimates of food supplies don't quite add up with reported consumption rates. These gaps might be innocent errors, trauma-induced confusion, or they might indicate that the official story smoothed over rougher truths. Still others focus on the fact that many chose to die rather than cross that line, finding that refusal more remarkable than the act itself. Patrick Breen's family, sustained by faith and prayer, somehow avoided the worst. How? Through luck? Through providence? Through hoarding? The answer depends on who's telling the story. The Breen's survival is one of the expedition's most interesting mysteries. They were not the wealthiest family, not the best provisioned, not the strongest physically. Yet every member of their family survived when other families were decimated. Patrick Breen's diary shows regular religious observance even in the worst conditions. Did faith actually sustain them? Or did that faith correlate with other behaviors, better planning, stricter rationing, more disciplined resource management? That actually made the difference. What's often overlooked in the sensational aspects is how much humanity persisted alongside horror. Parents still told their children stories to help them sleep, even when they were too weak to stand. People still prayed together, voices joining in familiar hymns that connected them to a world that felt impossibly distant. In the coldest, darkest nights when death seemed certain, people still reached for beauty, still sang, still told jokes that weren't funny but mattered anyway, still held each other for warmth and comfort, human touch remaining meaningful even when so much else had been stripped away. They still shared what little they had when sharing meant their own chances of survival decreased. They cared for each other's children when parents grew too weak. Compassion and horror coexisted in those cabins, neither cancelling the other out. There are documented instances of people giving their last rations to children not their own, of the strong helping the weak even when helping meant exhaustion, of strangers becoming family not through blood but through shared suffering, bonds formed that would last lifetimes for those who survived. There are accounts of Tamsin Donner, the school teacher, teaching lessons to children even as starvation set in. She maintained a routine of education because routine was all that kept chaos at bay, because teaching meant there would be a future that required educated children. Tamsin had been a teacher before the journey, educated herself, committed to learning and enlightenment. She taught reading, arithmetic, geography, subjects that seemed absurd in the context of their situation, but that provided structure and normalcy. The act of conjugating verbs or working through multiplication tables offered a kind of salvation, a reminder that the world beyond the mountains still existed and still had rules that made sense. Of Mary Graves helping younger children walk when the forlorn hope attempted their escape, carrying them when they couldn't go on, sharing her own meager rations when every bite meant the difference between life and death. Mary was 18, strong and determined, and she made a choice to be responsible for those weaker than herself. She could have moved faster alone, could have increased her own chances by abandoning the children. But she didn't. That choice cost her energy, warmth, food. It might have cost her life. That it didn't was perhaps luck, perhaps the universe rewarding virtue, perhaps simply the random chance that governs who lives and who dies. Of strangers sharing blankets and taking turns tending the fire through long dark nights, of people singing to keep spirits up, telling jokes that weren't funny but were told anyway because laughter was its own kind of resistance. The nights were the hardest. Darkness came early in the mountain winter, lasting 16 hours or more. In that darkness, with nothing to do but try to stay warm and wait for dawn, the mind could become an enemy. So they talked, they sang, they told stories of home, of the California they were trying to reach, of futures they might never see. They kept each other human by keeping each other connected. Suffering didn't erase kindness. It revealed who people truly were when everything else was stripped away. Some became monsters in the mountains, others became saints. Most became some complicated mixture of both. People made choices they never imagined they'd have to make. Some of those choices were noble, some were terrible, most were simply human, imperfect attempts to navigate impossible circumstances. Judging them from the comfort of the present, from a world where rescue is always available and starvation is rarely a concern, seems both necessary and utterly insufficient. The physical site today bears little resemblance to the hell it became in 1846. The cabins are long gone, their timbers rotted or burned or scavenged, though markers indicate where they stood, requiring imagination to picture the structures that once provided inadequate shelter. The markers are simple: stone monuments, bronze plaques, wooden signs that weather and fade and must be replaced periodically. They mark locations. Here stood the Murphy cabin. Here stood the Breen cabin. The coordinates are precise, established through archaeological investigation and historical records. But standing at these markers, looking at empty forest floor, it's hard to imagine the structures that once occupied this space. The forest has grown back, erasing the desperate clearing for firewood that once surrounded the camps. Trees now stand where stumps once dotted the landscape. Nature has reclaimed what humans briefly disturbed. The process took decades. At first, the clearings remained visible, bare patches in the forest where trees had been cut for firewood and shelter. Slowly, new growth filled in. Seedlings became saplings, became mature trees. Now the forest looks ancient, uninterrupted, as if humans had never been there at all. Nature's erasure is thorough and patient. Donner Lake is now a popular recreation area. Summer homes dot its shores, their windows reflecting sunlight off the water. Boats glide across its surface, children swim in its shallows, families picnic on its beaches. The real estate is expensive, lakefront property in the Sierra Nevada, with stunning views and easy access to both summer and winter recreation. The houses are beautiful, modern, fitted with every comfort. Their owners likely know the history, might even find it interesting in an abstract way, but it doesn't stop them from enjoying their property. The past doesn't haunt them the way it might haunt a historian or an archaeologist. But occasionally hikers report an odd feeling near the historic sites, not exactly haunted, but heavy somehow, as if the air holds more than usual, as if breathing it means inhaling more than oxygen. They describe a sense of unease they can't quite explain. The forest seems too quiet, or the shadows seem too deep, or the temperature seems to drop in ways that don't match the weather. Most dismiss the feeling quickly, attribute it to imagination or suggestion, but the feeling recurs across different visitors, different seasons, different levels of historical knowledge. Psychologists would call it suggestion, the power of knowing what happened to color present experience, the mind creating sensations because it expects to feel something in a place where such terrible things occurred. There's scientific support for this explanation. Our expectations shape our perceptions. Tell someone a place is haunted and they'll interpret ordinary sounds and sights as supernatural. Tell them about historical tragedy and they'll project that tragedy onto their present experience. The mind is suggestible, particularly in settings that already feel liminal. Forests, mountains, places where civilization feels thin, but the feeling persists anyway. This sense of bearing witness to suffering that can never be fully understood, of standing on ground that absorbed too much pain to ever be completely neutral again. Perhaps it's not supernatural, but also not entirely psychological. Perhaps places do hold memory in ways we don't fully understand. Perhaps the concentration of suffering leaves traces in the environment, not ghosts, but something more subtle, something that sensitive people perceive without being able to name it. Or perhaps it's simply that knowing what happened makes us more aware of the landscape's indifference, the way beauty and horror can occupy the same space without contradiction. In winter, when snow falls thick and the tourists leave, the area transforms. The same mountains that trapped the Donner Party still rise sharply, their peaks disappearing into clouds, their passes still treacherous, still capable of killing the unprepared. The winter landscape bears the closest resemblance to what the Donner Party experienced. Snow accumulates in drifts that can reach 20 feet or more. Storms move in with little warning, visibility dropping to 0 in minutes. Temperatures plunge well below freezing and stay there for months. Even with modern equipment and infrastructure, the mountains in winter are serious business. Modern highways and snowplows make crossing routine now. Interstate 80 follows roughly the same route the Donner Party took, but it's paved and maintained and monitored. Travelers cross in hours what took the pioneers months, never thinking about the difficulty. The highway is a marvel of engineering, cut through granite, bridged over chasms, fitted with avalanche barriers and snow sheds. Cameras monitor conditions constantly, plows work around the clock during storms, chain control stations ensure vehicles are equipped for winter conditions. The infrastructure that makes crossing trivial cost billions of dollars and decades of work. But the underlying geography remains unchanged. Stand there on a February evening when a storm is moving in and you can imagine it. The endless white, the bitter cold, the absolute isolation. Close your eyes and the highway disappears. The hum of traffic fades. You're left with what the Donner Party experienced. Mountains that go on forever. Snow that never stops falling. Cold that penetrates to the bone. The vulnerability is still there, barely held at bay by technology and organization. The wind sounds the same. The snow falls the same. The mountains are indifferent in the same way they've always been. Only the humans have changed, becoming softer, more dependent on infrastructure, less capable of surviving without it. We've traded resilience for comfort, self-sufficiency for specialization. Most modern people lack the skills that were basic competence in 1846, how to build a fire in wet conditions, how to find and purify water, how to judge weather by the sky, how to navigate without GPS. We've outsourced survival to systems and infrastructure which work brilliantly until they don't. Historians continue to debate the details of the Donner Party's ordeal. New evidence emerges occasionally, a letter discovered in an archive, a diary entry that changes perspective on known events. Technology allows new analysis of old artifacts, revealing secrets invisible to previous generations. Each generation of historians brings new tools and new questions to the story. Early historians focused on establishing basic facts and timelines. Mid-century scholars applied psychological frameworks, trying to understand decision-making under stress. Recent researchers use forensic science, DNA analysis, environmental reconstruction, and digital modeling to extract new information from old evidence. Ground-penetrating radar has been used to search for unmarked graves. DNA analysis helps identify bones found at the site. Forensic anthropology reveals patterns of trauma and disease that written accounts missed. The technology keeps improving. Isotope analysis can determine diet and geographic origin. Digital terrain modeling can reconstruct snow depth and weather patterns. Chemical analysis of soil can detect human remains even when no bones survive. Each new tool potentially answers old questions while raising new ones. But the big questions may never be fully answered. History protects some secrets, keeps them buried beneath layers of snow and time. And perhaps that's appropriate. Not everything needs to be exposed to satisfy curiosity. There's a voyeurism in some of the public interest in the Donner Party. a desire to know the worst details, to peer into the darkest moments. But the people who lived through it have a right to their privacy, even posthumously. Not every secret needs to be uncovered, not every horror needs to be documented in full detail. Some mysteries can remain mysterious without diminishing the historical value of the story. What we do know is that 48 people survived an ordeal that should have killed them all. They endured cold that modern people, with all our technology and preparation, would struggle to survive for even a few days. The average person today wouldn't last a week in those conditions, despite our belief in our own resilience. The survivors emerged from the mountains traumatized, physically damaged, haunted by memories they could never fully escape. But they emerged. They lived. Many went on to live long lives, to marry and have children, to build successful lives in California. The ordeal didn't define them entirely, though it marked them forever. They maintained some thread of humanity in circumstances that should have destroyed it. That's the real mystery. Not how they died, but how they lived. Not what they did to survive, but what they refused to do despite the cost. Every survivor had to live with their choices, with what they'd done or not done, with who they'd saved or failed to save. Some apparently made peace with it, others never did. But all of them chose to keep living, to move forward, to build futures despite pasts that could have destroyed them. The archaeological record shows interesting patterns in the camps. The Breen cabin, where the family maintained strict religious observance, shows different consumption patterns than others. Their faith sustained them in measurable ways, or perhaps they were simply luckier in their rationing. The Breen site shows more organized refuse patterns, less evidence of desperate scavenging, fewer scattered bones. Whether this reflects better management, religious prohibition against certain practices, or simply better record-keeping by rescuers who arrived there first remains unclear. But the pattern is distinct enough to be noticeable, significant enough to prompt questions. The Murphy cabin shows evidence of the most desperate conditions, the most scattered bones, the most signs of complete resource exhaustion. They were the poorest of the families, had started with less, and that initial disadvantage compounded over time. The Murphys had joined the party late with minimal supplies, hoping to work for their passage. They had less food, fewer resources, less margin for error. When everyone was running out, they ran out first. When everyone was desperate, they were most desperate. The archaeology confirms what the written record suggests, that class and wealth affected survival in measurable ways. The Donner camp at Alder Creek was more isolated 6 miles from the lake. This isolation may have been what killed George Donner as much as his infected hand. Help came to the lake first, and by the time rescuers reached Alder Creek, it was too late for many. George Donner, the expedition's leader, suffered a hand infection that should have been treatable, but without medical supplies, without clean water, without adequate nutrition, the infection became life-threatening. His wife Tamsin stayed with him when she could have left with rescuers, choosing loyalty over survival. Both died at Alder Creek, along with many others whose isolation proved fatal. Researchers have studied the weather patterns of that winter, comparing them to modern data. It was an unusually heavy snow year, but not unprecedented. The mountains regularly receive that much snow. The Donner Party was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Climate records reconstructed from tree rings show that the winter of 1846-47 was severe, but within the normal range of variation for the Sierra Nevada. There have been worse winters since. The difference is that modern infrastructure handles the snow. The Donner Party had nothing but themselves. If they'd arrived 2 weeks earlier, they would have crossed before the first major storm. If they'd been 2 weeks later, they might have turned back before becoming trapped. Timing was everything, and their timing was catastrophic. The margins were so thin. A few better decisions on the trail, not taking the Hastings cutoff, not pausing for extra rest days, not losing time to disputes and reorganizations. A slightly different weather pattern, a few more supplies. Any of these could have meant the difference between tragedy and successful passage. History turns on such small hinges. The role of Native Americans in the story is often overlooked. The Washoe and Paiute peoples who lived in the region knew how to survive mountain winters. They had knowledge that could have saved the emigrants, but relationships between settlers and native peoples were already strained by 1846. Native peoples had successfully wintered in the Sierra Nevada for thousands of years through extensive environmental knowledge, where to find winter food sources, how to construct adequate shelter, how to read weather patterns, when to retreat to lower elevations. And this knowledge was available, but the cultural divide prevented its transmission. Some Native Americans helped rescue efforts, guiding parties through the mountains. Others watched from a distance, perhaps understanding that the newcomers' suffering was partly their own arrogance. The land had rules, and those who ignored them paid the price regardless of their skin color or origin. Native guides led several rescue parties, using their knowledge of routes and conditions to reach the trapped emigrants. Their contribution is documented but often minimized in historical accounts. The complicated racial dynamics of the period made acknowledging indigenous help uncomfortable for many survivors and historians. The story of the Donner Party changed how Americans viewed westward expansion. It added a cautionary note to the triumphant narrative of manifest destiny. Suddenly the journey west seemed less like an adventure and more like a gamble where the stakes were life and death. Before the Donner Party, emigrant narratives emphasized opportunity, adventure, the romance of pioneering. After, a note of warning entered the literature. The West could kill you. Nature was not benevolent. Preparation and timing mattered. The myth of inevitable American triumph met the reality of human vulnerability. Travel guides became more detailed after 1846. Routes were mapped more carefully. Timetables were established to ensure parties crossed the mountains before winter. The lesson was learned, written in the suffering of those who'd learned it the hard way. Lansford Hastings, whose dubious shortcut had led the Donner Party into disaster, was discredited. His guidebook was revealed as speculation rather than experience. Future guides emphasized the proven northern route, adding clear warnings about crossing deadlines. The Donner Party's suffering educated a generation of emigrants, likely saving thousands of lives. In the silence of the lake now, there's a feeling of being watched. Not by ghosts, but by memory itself. The past observing the present with something like bewilderment at how much has changed and how quickly. Stand at the shore and look at the water, the mountains, the sky. The view is essentially unchanged from 1846, but everything human is different. The ease, the safety, the casual assumption that help is always available. The past might wonder at our softness, our dependence, our inability to conceive of the kind of suffering that was once common. So much has changed since 1846. The infrastructure, the safety measures, the certainty of rescue if things go wrong. Satellite phones can summon help from anywhere. Helicopters can reach places that would have taken rescuers weeks to access. Modern search and rescue is a miracle of technology and organization. GPS tracking, thermal imaging, rapid response teams, medical evacuation. People get lost in the Sierra Nevada now and are usually found within hours, sometimes minutes. The idea of being trapped for months without contact seems impossible in our connected age. Yet the mountains remain patient and indifferent, capable of the same cruelty if given the chance. Every few years, someone dies in the Sierra Nevada, a skier in an avalanche, a hiker caught in a storm, a climber who misjudged the difficulty. The mountains still kill. Less frequently, more selectively, but they still kill. Usually it's a combination of bad luck and bad judgment. Someone who went out unprepared, who ignored weather warnings, who overestimated their abilities. The mountains punish these errors swiftly, just as they did in 1846. The mountains still demand respect. They still punish the unprepared. They still don't care about human plans or hopes or determination. They simply are, as they've always been. This indifference is not malevolent. The mountains don't hate humans or wish them harm. They simply operate according to physical laws: temperature, precipitation, gravity, exposure. These laws don't bend for determination or courage or good intentions. They simply apply, consistently and without mercy. When snow falls there today, it covers everything evenly. The ground, the ruins, the forgotten graves. It covers the trail markers and the historical plaques. It covers the past until the landscape looks much as it did in 1846. Deep winter transforms the site completely. The lake freezes, the roads close, the summer homes sit empty. Snow buries everything under white silence. In these moments, the present dissolves and you can glimpse what the Donner Party saw: a world reduced to white and grey, cold and hunger, endurance and waiting. You can almost believe it forgives them, those desperate people who did desperate things to survive. Or perhaps it simply forgets, each new snowfall erasing the last. The land caring nothing for human drama or moral judgment. The snow is immoral. It falls the same on saints and sinners. It preserves and destroys with equal indifference. What we project onto it, forgiveness, forgetting, judgment, is human meaning imposed on natural process. The snow doesn't distinguish between the righteous and the desperate, between those who maintained their principles and those who surrendered them. It falls the same on everyone, covering all equally in white silence. In this way, perhaps the snow is the only fair judge. It makes no moral distinctions, holds no grudges, plays no favorites. It simply falls and covers and eventually melts, the cycle repeating forever, indifferent to human meanings. But we remember. We tell the story again and again, each generation finding new meaning in it. Sometimes it's a warning about hubris and the danger of shortcuts. Sometimes it's a testament to human resilience and the will to survive. The story serves different purposes at different times. For the Victorians, it was a morality tale about the dangers of abandoning civilized values. For mid-century Americans, it was about frontier resourcefulness and determination. For contemporary audiences, it raises questions about ethics under extreme pressure, about how we judge people facing impossible choices. Sometimes it's simply a reminder that survival is more complicated than we like to admit, more morally ambiguous than comfortable narratives allow, more human than either the heroic or horrific versions suggest. We want clear stories, heroes and villains, right and wrong, triumph and tragedy. The Donner Party story resists these simplifications. People were brave and cowardly, generous and selfish, noble and desperate, often within the same hour. The story's power lies partly in this complexity, in its refusal to resolve into easy moral lessons. The mystery isn't really about what happened in those cabins during the darkest weeks. Historians have pieced together a reasonably clear picture from the available evidence. The basic facts are known, even if some details remain forever unclear. We know the timeline, the death toll, the rescue efforts. We know what food was available and when it ran out. We know who survived and who didn't. We know from archaeology and forensics what happened to many of the bodies. The facts are documented well enough that the main narrative is solid. The mystery is about what we would do in the same situation. Would we share our last scrap of food with someone else's child? Would we give up our place on a rescue party for someone weaker? Would we maintain our principles or surrender them to necessity? These questions feel abstract in the asking, but they're terrifyingly concrete in the living. It's easy to say what we'd do from the comfort of full bellies and warm rooms. Much harder to know what we'd actually do when starving and freezing, when every choice is between bad and worse. When survival requires calculations we hope we never have to make. These questions have no easy answers. They can't be answered in the abstract, from the comfort of a warm room with a full stomach. They can only be answered in the moment, under the pressure of actual survival, when theory becomes reality. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the story. Not what happened to them, but what might happen to us. Not their choices, but the choices we might face. The Donner Party weren't monsters or heroes. They were ordinary people, farmers, merchants, families who encountered extraordinary circumstances, which means it could happen to anyone. And that's perhaps why the Donner Party story continues to haunt us nearly 2 centuries later, because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the thin line between civilization and savagery, about the choices we might make if pushed far enough. Civilization is thinner than we think. We're separated from our ancestors' struggles by a few generations of abundance, by infrastructure and institutions that feel permanent but are actually quite fragile. The Donner Party reminds us that we're always closer to the edge than we imagine, that the veneer of civilization is maintained through comfort and plenty, not inherent virtue. The archaeological work continues at the site. Each summer, researchers return to excavate small sections, searching for more artifacts, more answers. They work carefully, documenting every find, treating the site with the reverence due to a place where so many suffered and died. The excavations are limited now. Most of the site is protected, excavation permitted only when it serves clear research purposes. The work requires permits, consultation with descendant communities, ethical review. The site is treated as what it is, a mass grave, a memorial, a place that demands respect. They find small things mostly, a button, a nail, a fragment of pottery. Individually, these artifacts seem insignificant. Collectively, they tell a story of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Each artifact is catalogued, analyzed, contextualized. A button becomes evidence of where someone lived or died. A nail indicates cabin construction techniques. A pottery fragment suggests which families had what supplies. Small things accumulate into larger stories, fragments assembling into narratives. And that story, told through objects left behind in the snow, is ultimately one of endurance, of people who kept their humanity longer than anyone might expect, who helped each other even when helping meant personal cost, who survived not just physically but morally, carrying the burden of their choices but not being destroyed by them. The survivors scattered after rescue, dispersing across California and beyond. Some stayed in the Sacramento area where they'd been brought for recovery. Others moved on, seeking distance from the mountains and from each other, from the shared memories that bound them together in uncomfortable ways. Many survivors prospered despite their ordeal. They acquired land, built businesses, raised families. William Eddy became a successful farmer. The Reed family accumulated considerable wealth. The Breen children grew up, married, had children of their own. Life continued as it must, even after trauma that should have ended it. But the experience marked them all. In photographs taken years later, you can sometimes see it in their eyes, a distance, a wariness, a knowledge of things most people never have to know. They carried the mountains with them wherever they went, an internal landscape of cold and hunger that never entirely thawed. Some survivors became advocates for improved emigrant routes and better preparation. They spoke at meetings, wrote articles, counseled westward-bound families. They tried to extract meaning from their suffering by preventing others from experiencing the same. If their ordeal could save even one life, perhaps it hadn't been entirely purposeless. Others refused to discuss it at all. They built walls around those months, separating their present selves from their past selves, creating a kind of internal quarantine. When asked, they changed the subject or gave the briefest possible answers. The past was past, and they intended to keep it there. The children who survived grew up with fragmented memories of the ordeal. Too young to fully understand what was happening at the time, they retained impressions. Cold, darkness, fear, their parents' faces tight with worry. As adults, some sought out other survivors to fill in the gaps in their memories. Others preferred not to know. One survivor, interviewed in old age, said the hardest part wasn't the hunger or the cold. It was carrying the knowledge of what people, including herself, were capable of when pushed. The loss of innocence, the understanding that civilization was optional, that anyone could become something they'd never imagined. That knowledge changed how she saw everyone, including herself, for the rest of her life. The descendants of survivors often carry complicated feelings about their ancestry. Pride in their forebears' survival and strength. Discomfort with the darker aspects of the story. Questions about what their ancestors did or didn't do. The family histories are incomplete, carefully curated, certain topics avoided across generations. Some descendant families embrace the history, participate in commemorations, contribute to historical research. Others want nothing to do with it, finding the public fascination ghoulish or the family connection embarrassing. There's no consensus on how to inherit this particular legacy. The land holds these stories still, in the soil beneath the forest floor, in the patterns of tree growth around old cabin sites, in the quiet that sometimes settles over certain spots, as if the earth itself is remembering, bearing witness to what happened there so long ago. Geologists can read the land's history in layers of rock and soil. Dendrochronologists read it in tree rings, years of drought, years of heavy snow, the specific winter of 1846-47 visible in growth patterns. The land is a text if you know how to read it. Every layer a page, every anomaly a footnote. The forest that grew back over the cabin sites is different from the surrounding forest. Trees planted in disturbed soil grow differently. The chemical composition of soil where bodies decomposed shows variations detectable decades later. Nature reclaimed the site but didn't erase it. The human presence is still there, invisible to casual observers but evident to those who look closely. Animals move through the area without hesitation, following their own concerns. Deer graze where cabins stood. Bears pass through on their seasonal migrations. Birds nest in trees that grew from soil enriched by human tragedy. The natural world has fully reintegrated the site, indifferent to its history. Yet humans often feel differently. Park rangers report that visitors sometimes become emotional at the historic sites, even those who came for recreation rather than history. Something in the atmosphere affects them. They might not even know the details of what happened, but they sense that this place is different somehow. The interpretive materials at the site have evolved over the years. Early markers were blunt, sometimes sensational, emphasizing the cannibalism and horror. Later installations became more thoughtful, contextualizing the tragedy within broader emigrant history. Current interpretations try to balance historical accuracy with sensitivity to both the victims and their descendants. There's ongoing debate about how to memorialize the Donner Party. Should the emphasis be on the tragedy, the survival, the lessons learned? Should individual victims be named and remembered, or would that invade their privacy? How do you honor suffering without sensationalizing it? How do you educate without traumatizing young visitors? Museums in the area display artifacts from the site, buttons, tools, fragments of clothing. Behind glass, these objects become almost sacred relics, physical connections to unimaginable suffering. Visitors lean in close, trying to imagine the hands that touched these items, the circumstances under which they were abandoned. School groups visit the site regularly. Teachers use the Donner Party story to teach about westward expansion, about decision-making and consequences, about survival and ethics. It's a challenging teaching moment. How do you discuss cannibalism with 10-year-olds? How do you convey the horror without causing nightmares? How do you acknowledge the complexity without confusing the lesson? The story has entered popular culture in ways both respectful and exploitative. Books, films, TV episodes, even video games reference the Donner Party. Some treatments are historically informed and thoughtful. Others use the story as mere shock value, reducing real suffering to entertainment. The victims and survivors have no say in how their story is told and retold. Artists have found inspiration in the story. Paintings depicting the snow-covered camps, the desperate rescues, the mountain landscape, poems exploring themes of survival and sacrifice, novels imagining the internal experiences of the trapped emigrants. Some of this art illuminates aspects of the story that historical accounts miss. Some feels exploitative, mining tragedy for dramatic effect. The question of whose story this is remains contested. Is it the story of American westward expansion, of human endurance, of bad decision-making and its consequences? Each framing emphasizes different aspects, creates different narratives, serves different purposes. The story is large enough to contain multiple interpretations without being exhausted by any of them. Indigenous perspectives on the story are increasingly being incorporated into interpretations. For the Washoe and Paiute peoples, the Donner Party tragedy confirmed what they already knew: that the land demanded knowledge and respect, that arrogance was punished, that the mountains gave nothing to those who didn't understand them. The story also marked the beginning of massive changes to their own lives as emigration accelerated. Environmental historians see the Donner Party as a case study in ecological disaster. The emigrants' lack of environmental knowledge, their failure to adapt to local conditions, their reliance on strategies that worked in other environments but failed in the Sierra Nevada. The tragedy demonstrates what happens when people impose their expectations on nature rather than learning from it. Modern survival experts study the Donner Party for lessons in what not to do. The poor planning, the bad leadership decisions, the failure to turn back when turning back was still possible. But also for lessons in what worked. The Breens' disciplined rationing, the forlorn hope's determination, the rescuers' courage. The story contains both cautionary and inspirational elements. Climate scientists reference the winter of 1846-47 as a data point in understanding Sierra Nevada weather patterns. The tree ring records from that year help establish baselines for snow accumulation and temperature. Understanding past extremes helps predict future ones, helps plan infrastructure and emergency response. Scientific value extracted from historical tragedy. The psychology of extreme survival situations has been illuminated by studying the Donner Party, how groups fracture under stress, how leadership emerges or fails, how individuals cope with impossible choices, how trauma affects memory and narrative. The behavioral patterns documented in the Donner Party appear in other survival situations, suggesting universal aspects of human response to extremity. Medical historians examine the effects of prolonged starvation, exposure, and vitamin deficiency. The symptoms survivors exhibited, the diseases that killed many, the permanent health effects some survivors carried for life. The Donner Party provides a grim but informative case study in what happens to human bodies under extreme deprivation. Anthropologists study the story for insights into cultural practices around food, death, and taboo. How different families within the party responded differently to the same circumstances. How cultural and religious backgrounds influenced behavior. How social structures persisted or broke down under pressure. The story reveals the foundations of culture by showing what happens when those foundations are tested to destruction. The site itself has been shaped by its history. Tourism has been both blessing and curse. It brings attention and funding for preservation and research, but it also brings crowds, trampling, artifact theft. Balancing public access with site protection is an ongoing challenge. How do you let people connect with history without destroying the very evidence that makes that connection meaningful? The lake itself has been affected. Originally called Truckee Lake, it was renamed Donner Lake by later emigrants and settlers. Some descendants of survivors have objected to the name, feeling their ancestors' suffering is being used for tourism marketing. Others embrace it as appropriate memorialization. The lake itself, of course, has no opinion. It simply reflects whatever sky hangs above it. Property values in the area are affected by the history in complicated ways. Some find living near such a historically significant site appealing. Others are unsettled by it. Real estate agents navigate this carefully, mentioning the history to those who seem interested, downplaying it for those who seem uncomfortable. The past is a selling point or a liability depending on the buyer. Long-time residents of the area have complex relationships with the Donner Party history. It's part of local identity, a source of pride in the region's dramatic past. But the constant tourist questions, the sensationalism, the way outsiders fixate on the cannibalism rather than the broader story, these can be wearying. Local historians work to provide more nuanced interpretations, to contextualize the tragedy within the larger emigrant experience. The rescue parties themselves deserve recognition, often overshadowed by the story of the trapped emigrants, the men who organized relief efforts, who carried food and supplies over the mountains in deep snow, who led weakened survivors back to safety. They risked their own lives repeatedly. Some died in the attempt. Their courage tends to be forgotten in favor of the more dramatic story of entrapment and survival. The first rescue party reached the lake on February 18, 1847. They had climbed through 15-foot snowdrifts carrying packs of food, knowing what they'd find but unprepared for the reality. The scene that greeted them, starving people, makeshift shelters, the smell of death, haunted the rescuers for the rest of their lives. Several wrote that they wished they'd never gone, that the memories were too terrible to bear. Yet they went back. 3 more rescue parties followed the first, each one harder as the snow deepened and the survivors grew weaker. The last rescue in April found only 1 person still alive at the lake, Louis Keseberg, surrounded by evidence of what he'd done to survive. The rescuers judged him harshly, and history has generally concurred, but the judgment seems cruel given that he'd simply lasted longest in an impossible situation. The question of judgment hangs over the entire story. By what standard do we judge people in extremity? By the standards of their time or ours? By what they did or what they refused to do? By their survival or their methods? The Donner Party forces these questions, but provides no easy answers. Some philosophers use the Donner Party as a thought experiment in ethics. The trolley problem writ large and historical. If eating the dead saves the living, is it permissible, required? Is there a moral difference between someone who died naturally and someone whose death was hastened, between eating strangers and eating family? These questions feel academic until they're real. Religious interpretations of the story vary. Some see divine punishment for greed or poor judgment. Others see random tragedy in an indifferent universe. Still others see opportunities for faith tested and sometimes proven. The Breen's survival through prayer, the moments of grace and kindness amid horror. The story accommodates multiple theological interpretations without confirming any of them. The role of gender in the story is significant and often under-analyzed. Women and men faced different challenges and made different choices. Women were expected to maintain domesticity even in impossible circumstances, to care for children, to preserve civilized behavior. Some succeeded remarkably. Others, like Tamsin Donner, sacrificed themselves in ways that seem both admirable and tragic. Children in the party had no agency over their circumstances. They suffered and died through no fault of their own, victims of adult decisions and bad luck. The survival rate for children was lower than for adults, and those who survived carried trauma that shaped their entire lives. Their perspectives are largely lost. Children's voices rarely survive in historical records. The class dynamics within the party affected outcomes. Wealthy families like the Reeds started with more supplies and better equipment. Poor families like the Murphys were disadvantaged from the start. When everyone was starving, prior wealth mattered less, but it still mattered. The wealthy had more to draw on before reaching absolute desperation. Leadership was contested throughout the ordeal. George Donner was nominally the leader, but his authority dissolved as conditions worsened. James Reed emerged as a leader during rescue efforts. Others led through example rather than authority. The breakdown of normal social hierarchies under extreme stress is one of the story's interesting subtexts. The role of misinformation and bad advice looms large. Lansford Hastings promised a shortcut that didn't exist. The party trusted guidebooks written by people who'd never traveled the routes they described. They made decisions based on incomplete and inaccurate information, a reminder that knowledge is survival and ignorance can be fatal. Communication, or its lack, was crucial. If the party had known what awaited them, they would have made different choices. If they'd been able to signal their distress earlier, rescue might have come sooner. They were isolated not just physically, but informationally, cut off from knowledge that would have saved them. The weather itself remains subject to analysis. Was the winter of 1846-47 truly exceptional? Or were the emigrants simply unprepared for a normal Sierra winter? Evidence suggests both. The snow was heavier than average, but not unprecedented. What made it catastrophic was timing and the party's lack of preparation for mountain winter conditions. Modern climate change adds another layer to the story. The Sierra Nevada snowpack is declining, winters are generally milder, and the kind of extreme winter the Donner Party experienced is becoming less common. In a strange sense, the tragedy is becoming less relatable as the climate changes. Future visitors may struggle to imagine the conditions that made the disaster possible. The story endures partly because it's fundamentally dramatic, life and death stakes, impossible choices, a clear narrative arc from optimism through disaster to survival. It has elements of thriller, horror, adventure, and human drama. It's naturally compelling in ways that make it irresistible to storytellers and audiences alike, but it endures also because it asks questions we can't stop asking. What would we do? How would we handle it? Would we be heroes or villains or something in between? Could we make the same mistakes? Could we survive the same challenges? The story is a mirror that shows us things we're not sure we want to see. The land remembers everything: the snow that fell, the cold that killed, the hunger that drove people to unimaginable acts, the courage that persisted alongside the horror, the love that survived when everything else failed. All of it is still there, written in layers only certain tools can read. And we remember too, in our way, not the details, those fade and distort with time. But the essence, that survival is complicated, that people are capable of both terrible and beautiful things, that judgment is easier than understanding. We remember because the story won't let us forget, because it speaks to something fundamental about what it means to be human when humanity is tested past all reasonable limits. The site will remain as long as humans value history, protected, studied, visited, interpreted. The land will continue its slow processes of growth and decay, absorption and transformation. And somewhere in the balance between preservation and change, between remembering and forgetting, the story of the Donner Party will persist, uncomfortable, important, eternally relevant. Because in the end, it's not really about them, it's about us. About what we're capable of, for better and worse. About the choices we hope we never have to make, but might. About the thin line between the life we know and the life we can barely imagine. The Donner Party crossed that line, and some came back to tell about it. We listen because we need to understand what lies on the other side, even as we hope never to cross ourselves. While the Donner Party froze in the Sierra Nevada, a different world existed just beyond the mountains. In 1846, California's wealthy rancheros and established settlers lived amid citrus groves, vineyards, and Spanish-style haciendas with thick adobe walls. The same winter that buried wagons in snow brought gentle rains to their fields, nourishing crops and filling streams with water that would irrigate summer harvests. You can imagine the sound of a guitar under a veranda at twilight, the notes drifting across courtyards where fountains bubbled and flowers bloomed even in winter, the scent of roasted corn and chili peppers drifting from outdoor kitchens where cooks prepared meals that would feed dozens, the slow rhythm of life untouched by disaster, where tomorrow would arrive much like today, predictable and pleasant, where the greatest concern might be whether the cattle had enough grazing land or whether the wine from last year's harvest had aged properly. Wealth was measured differently in Mexican California than in the American states the emigrants had left, not in cash or bank accounts, but in cattle that numbered in the thousands, in land grants measured by leagues rather than acres, vast territories given by the Spanish crown or Mexican government to favored families, in leisure time that allowed for poetry and music and philosophical discussion, in family connections that stretched across generations and linked the great families of California into a network of power and influence. The rancheros lived well without being ostentatious about it, their comfort arising from abundance rather than luxury. They hosted gatherings that lasted for days, fandangos where neighbors rode for miles to share food, music, and news, where guitars and violins played until dawn, and children fell asleep in corners while adults danced and talked. These events weren't just entertainment but social infrastructure. They maintained bonds between families separated by distance. They arranged marriages between great houses. They discussed politics and business and the strange changes coming to California. Some of them heard rumors during that winter. A trapped wagon train, starving families somewhere up in the mountains. The news arrived slowly, carried by Native Americans who traveled between the mountains and the valleys, or by the occasional traveler who'd made it through before the worst snows hit. But from the comfort of the lowlands it was easy to dismiss such talk, frontier gossip, exaggeration, or simply too distant to require personal concern. The mountains were far away, and the problems of strangers felt even farther. The elite discussed other matters instead, the growing American presence in their territory, which had begun as a trickle and become a flood. These newcomers didn't understand California's ways, didn't respect the established order, and seemed determined to impose their own customs. The weakness of the Mexican government, unable to assert control over its northern frontier. Mexico City was too far away to manage California effectively. The territory had always been semi-autonomous, and that autonomy was becoming complete independence in all but name. The future of California itself became the topic of endless debate. Would it remain Mexican, at least nominally? Would it become an independent republic like Texas had? Or would it fall to the Americans who kept arriving in such numbers, bringing their strange ideas about land ownership and governance? And so, while one group of Americans clawed through snow to stay alive, another sat in candlelight debating destiny and politics. They drank wine from their own vineyards, ate beef from their own herds, and slept in beds that never grew cold. The contrast wasn't intentional cruelty, it was simply the nature of geography and circumstance. The American settlers who'd arrived earlier and established themselves comfortably in California often knew of the Donner Party's plight. News traveled slowly, but it traveled. By January, people in the Sacramento Valley knew that emigrants were trapped in the mountains. Some, like John Sutter, who ran Sutter's Fort, organized rescue attempts when news finally reached them. Sutter was himself an immigrant, a Swiss man who'd built an empire in California through ambition and political skill. He understood the desperation of newcomers and felt obligation to help. But the distance was great, the weather impossible, and not everyone felt obligated to risk their own lives for strangers. Some argued that the emigrants had made their own choices, had ignored warnings and taken dangerous shortcuts. Why should others die trying to save them from their own poor decisions? There was a certain frontier pragmatism at work. People got themselves into trouble through poor planning or bad luck all the time. You helped when you could, but you didn't destroy yourself doing it. The calculation was cold but understandable in a place where survival often depended on not overextending yourself. Yet some did help, organizing multiple rescue parties despite the danger and expense. James Reed's benefactors in California funded his attempts to reach his family. They gave him supplies, horses, and men willing to brave the mountains in winter. Others contributed what they could: supplies for the rescue parties, horses that might not return, their own labor volunteering to join the dangerous expeditions. Human compassion wasn't dead, just complicated by distance and difficulty and the harsh mathematics of frontier life. The wealthy Californios, the established Mexican families, generally stayed out of American problems. This was partly cultural. The Americans were newcomers, outsiders, not their responsibility. The Californios had their own people to worry about, their own obligations to family and community. But it was also political. Tensions between Mexican California and the arriving Americans were high in 1846. The Bear Flag Revolt had occurred that summer, with American settlers declaring California independent from Mexico. Though the revolt was quickly superseded by the Mexican-American War, the tensions remained. The Donner Party represented everything the Californios found troubling about the newcomers: their recklessness, pushing into territory they didn't understand, their sense of entitlement to land that wasn't theirs, that had been granted to Mexican families generations ago, their willingness to risk everything for dreams that seemed more like delusions. When spring finally came and the survivors of the Donner Party began arriving in California's valleys, they entered a world that must have seemed impossible. Green fields after months of white, grass and flowers and trees in full leaf after endless barren snow, warmth after endless cold, sun that actually warmed the skin instead of reflecting blindingly off snow, temperatures where you could stand outside without layers of clothing, where your fingers didn't hurt, where breathing didn't burn your lungs, food in abundance after desperate starvation, tables with bread and meat and vegetables, fruit hanging from trees, cattle grazing in fields so thick you couldn't see the ground. The contrast was so severe it must have felt hallucinatory, like entering a different world entirely, but no parades greeted them, no celebrations marked their survival. There was sympathy, certainly, and charity from those who had it to give. Churches collected donations, individuals offered work or temporary shelter, but there was also discomfort, an unease about what these people represented. They were reminders that the American dream had a dark side, that manifest destiny could manifest as tragedy, that the journey west wasn't always triumphant. The survivors found themselves in an awkward position socially. They needed help, food, shelter, work, a way to rebuild their lives. They had nothing, having lost everything in the mountains. They were dependent on the charity of strangers, but they also carried the stain of their ordeal, the whispered accusations of what they'd done to survive. Society didn't know quite how to treat them, as heroes for surviving impossible conditions, or as victims to be pitied, or as something more disturbing that didn't fit into comfortable categories. Some integrated successfully into California life. They never spoke of their ordeal and started fresh. They took new names sometimes, moved to areas where their history wasn't known. They built new lives and tried to bury the past. Others wore their trauma visibly, unable to escape it even in paradise. They struggled with work, with relationships, with the simple act of living normally. The winter had broken something in them that couldn't be repaired. The children who survived often did better than the adults. Their resilience allowed them to move forward in ways their parents couldn't. They had fewer memories to haunt them, less guilt to carry. They could imagine futures untainted by the past. Virginia Reed, James Reed's teenage daughter, grew up to live a long life. She married, had children, and eventually wrote about her experiences. Her account is one of the few survivor narratives, valuable for its detail and relatively positive tone. Patty Reed, younger when the ordeal occurred, remembered less and suffered less. She kept a wooden doll that had traveled with her through the snow, a tangible connection to her childhood that had ended so abruptly in the mountains. The wealthy classes of California continued their comfortable existence largely undisturbed by the Donner tragedy. The gold rush would arrive in just 2 years, transforming everything. But for now, life remained pleasant for those who had established themselves. They watched the bedraggled survivors arrive and felt what? Pity, certainly. Superiority, perhaps, the natural response of those who'd made better choices. Guilt, maybe, though that was less common and easily suppressed. The Californio families saw their worst fears confirmed. The Americans were reckless, unprepared, unsuited for California. Yet they kept coming, and each wave brought more. The demographic balance was shifting irreversibly, and the old order was dying. It's an unsettling symmetry that exists throughout history. The comfort of some resting on the suffering of others, even if only by chance. The same expansion that promised freedom and opportunity to some took everything from others. The frontier was never equal, never fair, never the level playing field that mythology suggested. Some people started with advantages, money, connections, knowledge, luck. Others started with nothing and were expected to overcome everything through sheer determination. The Donner Party started with disadvantages that compounded over time. They weren't the wealthiest emigrants. They joined the wagon train late. They made poor decisions about routes. Each disadvantage multiplied the others until disaster became inevitable. Meanwhile, the established families of California had every advantage: land, water, climate, infrastructure, knowledge. They didn't have to struggle because their ancestors had struggled for them. They inherited comfort and mistook it for virtue. You realize slowly that history is never one story. It's always at least two happening simultaneously. The starving and the feasting, the suffering and the oblivious, the desperate and the comfortable, the dying and the thriving. And the people living through it rarely see both sides clearly. The Californios didn't fully understand what was happening in the mountains. The Donner Party survivors couldn't comprehend the comfort that existed so close to their suffering. Each group existed in its own reality, its own bubble of experience. The mountains might as well have been on another planet for how separate these worlds were. Geography is destiny, and a few dozen miles of snow-covered passes created an unbridgeable gulf. The rancheros eventually lost their land to the Americans. Their comfortable world was dismantled by courts that didn't recognize Spanish land grants, by claim jumpers who took what they wanted and dared anyone to stop them, by the flood of newcomers after gold was discovered in 1848. Within a generation, the great estates were broken up. The Californio families were reduced to comparative poverty or absorbed through marriage into the American system. Their language, their customs, their entire way of life became historical footnotes. Perhaps there's a kind of justice in that, or perhaps it's just the frontier's indifference asserting itself again. The same forces that killed the Donner Party members killed Californio culture, not through malice but through sheer, overwhelming force. The wheel turned, and those who'd been comfortable found themselves displaced. Their land taken through legal mechanisms they didn't understand. Their political power evaporated as Americans became the majority. Their children speaking English instead of Spanish, adopting American customs, marrying American spouses. The Donner Party survivors, meanwhile, scattered across California and beyond. Some prospered in the gold rush economy, finding gold or, more commonly, providing services to those looking for it, building businesses, acquiring land, achieving the success they'd originally sought. Others struggled throughout their lives, never quite recovering from the trauma, moving frequently, unable to settle, haunted by memories they couldn't escape. They died young sometimes, worn out by what they'd endured. The children grew up and had families of their own. They rarely discussed the winter that shaped them. Some of their own children didn't learn about their parents' ordeal until they were adults themselves. The silence was protective, an attempt to shield the next generation from inherited trauma. They built lives in the shadow of that winter, carrying their past quietly and hoping the next generation could live lighter. Sometimes it worked, and sometimes trauma has a way of transmitting itself even through silence. And somewhere in between those two worlds, the elite and the desperate, the comfortable and the suffering, lies the truth of expansion, of manifest destiny, of what it really meant to build a new nation in a harsh land. Not the mythology of noble pioneers and inevitable progress, not the narrative of virtuous settlers taming a wilderness, but the messy reality of hunger and privilege coexisting, of suffering and indifference occupying the same geography, of survival coming at costs that are rarely acknowledged. The stories we tell about westward expansion tend to focus on triumph, the successful journeys, the towns built, the civilization brought to wild places. We celebrate the Oregon Trail survivors, not the ones who died along the way. But the Donner Party forces us to confront the costs, to acknowledge that expansion meant suffering and death for some, that the journey west was a gamble where many lost, that the dream of California came at a price not everyone could pay. The elite of California, both the Californios and the successful American settlers, benefited from a system that produced stories like the Donner Party. They needed cheap labor, needed people desperate enough to work for little. The survivors provided that labor. They needed cautionary tales to justify their own success. See, they could say, "We made it because we were smarter, more prepared, more deserving." The implication being that those who died failed through their own inadequacy rather than bad luck. This narrative served important psychological functions. It allowed the comfortable to sleep well. It explained inequality as natural rather than structural. It transformed accident of birth and circumstance into moral virtue, but the truth was simpler and more disturbing. The Donner Party and the California elite were separated by timing, luck, and a few key decisions. There was no moral difference, no fundamental superiority, just chance and circumstance playing out over months and miles. The survivors understood this in ways others couldn't. They'd seen how quickly civilization disappeared when pushed, how thin the veneer of culture was when survival was at stake, how luck, and not virtue, determined who lived and who died. This understanding made them different. They couldn't fully participate in the myths others told about westward expansion. They knew too much, had seen too clearly. The frontier had revealed truths that comfort preferred to keep hidden. As the years passed and California grew into a state, the Donner Party story became sanitized. The most disturbing details were softened. The survivors were portrayed as either heroes or victims, categories that felt safer than the complicated truth. Museums were built, monuments erected, trails marked. The story became tourist attraction, lesson in perseverance, cautionary tale. Anything except what it actually was, a mirror showing what people become when civilization fails them. The wealthy families who'd lived comfortably through that winter disappeared into history as surely as the Donner Party members who died, their names forgotten, their estates divided, their way of life extinct. Time has a way of equalizing that geography couldn't. Now we cross the Sierra Nevada on Interstate 80, passing Donner Lake without thinking. Driving in heated cars on paved roads at 70 miles per hour. The journey that took the Donner Party months takes us hours. We barely notice the difficulty. We've conquered the geography through technology, built our way through mountains, around obstacles, over rivers. The frontier that defeated so many has been tamed, domesticated, rendered safe for suburban comfort. But the mountains remain, patient and indifferent, still capable of killing those who underestimate them. Every winter someone dies up there, caught in a storm, buried in an avalanche, frozen on a trail they thought they knew. The mountains don't care about our highways and heated cars. They tolerate our presence, but could reassert their dominance at any moment. An earthquake, a massive storm, an infrastructure failure, and suddenly we'd be as vulnerable as the Donner Party was. That vulnerability is what we've forgotten. What comfort and technology allow us to ignore. We've created systems so reliable, we mistake them for natural law. We've built protections so complete, we forget we need protecting. The Donner Party reminds us otherwise, reminds us that humans are fragile, that civilization is temporary, that the natural world doesn't care about our plans or our progress or our sense of entitlement to comfort and safety. This lesson makes people uncomfortable, so we tell the story in ways that soften it. We focus on individual failures, bad decisions, poor planning, unfortunate timing. We avoid the deeper truth that no amount of good decisions guarantees survival. The elite of any era prefer to believe their comfort is earned, that they're safe because they're smart or virtuous or hardworking. The alternative, that they're safe because they're lucky, is too terrifying to accept. But the Donner Party and the California elite of 1846 teach the same lesson from opposite sides. Life is fragile. Security is temporary. The distance between comfort and catastrophe is shorter than we imagine. Tonight, as the world softens into stillness around you, imagine that snow-covered mountain one more time. Frozen, quiet, endless. The wind moves through the pines the same way it did in 1846, indifferent to human presence or absence, carrying no memory of the suffering it witnessed. Somewhere in that cold silence, hope flickered once. Dim but alive, kept burning by sheer will when everything else had gone dark. People huddled in rough cabins told stories to keep children calm. They shared their last scraps with neighbors. They tried, even when trying seemed pointless. And maybe that's what history really is, not just tragedy or triumph, but the persistence of something human where there should be none. The fact that compassion survived alongside horror, that kindness persisted even when being kind meant personal cost, that people helped each other even when help couldn't save everyone. You're lying somewhere warm now, probably. A bed with blankets, soft and clean. A room with heat, temperature controlled to precise comfort. A world where winter is an inconvenience rather than a death sentence. That comfort was built on the backs of people like the Donner Party. Not directly, but collectively. Every frontier crossed, every hardship endured, every person who survived the impossible made the world slightly easier for those who came after. Their suffering purchased our convenience, though we rarely acknowledge the debt. The survivors of that winter went on to live full lives, most of them. They married, raised children, built homes, and participated in the building of California. They helped construct the very comfort that we now take for granted. But they tried to forget, most of them. Tried to bury the memories of that winter deep where they couldn't surface. But the mountain never forgot, and neither do we, not really. We tell their story on nights like this, when the world is quiet and history feels close enough to touch. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, if these slow journeys through time ease you towards sleep, consider liking the video or subscribing, but only if it truly brings you peace. Only if these quiet passages through history help you drift into restful darkness. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. There's something oddly comforting about knowing who else is drifting off to the same slow march through history. Knowing that across time zones and distances, we're all connected by these shared stories of what humans endured and survived. The snow still falls in the Sierra Nevada each winter, just as it always has. The passes still close when storms move through. The mountains still test anyone foolish enough to underestimate them, still demand respect from those who venture into their realm. But we cross them easily now, mostly. In heated cars on paved roads, barely noticing the danger. We've forgotten what it meant to fear winter, to respect it as something that could kill. We've lost the understanding that our ancestors had, that nature doesn't negotiate, doesn't compromise, doesn't care about human plans. Perhaps that forgetting is progress. Perhaps it's the point of all that suffering, to make the world safe enough that future generations can forget how dangerous it once was, to create comfort so complete that people don't need to remember the cost. Or perhaps it's just distance from reality. A dangerous illusion that technology has solved problems that can never truly be solved, that we've conquered nature rather than simply bought ourselves temporary advantage against it. Either way, the story remains, a reminder of what people endured, what they sacrificed, what they became when everything else was stripped away. It's not a comfortable story, not one that lets us feel purely good about ourselves or our history. But comfort isn't always what we need. Sometimes we need to remember that warmth is a gift, not a guarantee. That safety is fragile, not permanent. That survival is never guaranteed, never something we can take for granted, no matter how secure we feel. The Donner Party teaches us about limits. The limits of human endurance. The limits of willpower against circumstance. The limits of preparation against bad luck. The limits of civilization when pushed too far from its infrastructure. But it also teaches us about capacity. The capacity for compassion in desperate circumstances. The capacity for hope when hope seems irrational. The capacity for love strong enough to keep people human when being human was harder than giving up. So let yourself drift now. Let these thoughts settle like snow. Let the weight of blankets anchor you to the present while your mind wanders through the past. Let the story cover you gently, smoothing the edges of consciousness, easing you towards sleep. Dream of warmth if you dream at all. Dream of safety and comfort, and the simple blessing of waking up in a world that doesn't actively try to kill you. Dream of all the small miracles we've stopped noticing because they happen every day. And be grateful if you can summon gratitude before sleep takes you. Grateful for the bed beneath you and the roof above. Grateful for the heat that keeps winter at bay and the food that keeps hunger away. Grateful for all the struggles you don't have to endure because others endured them for you. The people of the Donner Party didn't set out to be heroes or victims or cautionary tales. They set out to be pioneers, to build new lives in a new place. They wanted what everyone wants: safety, comfort, opportunity, hope. They failed through no particular fault of their own, victims of timing and weather and the accumulated weight of small bad decisions. But their failure taught lessons that success never could, about vulnerability and resilience, about the distance between civilization and savagery, about what remains when everything else is taken away. These lessons are written in snow and silence, in archaeological fragments and fading diaries, in the landscape itself. The mountains remember even when we forget. The land holds the story even when we stop telling it. History isn't just what's written in books, but what's embedded in places waiting to be uncovered by those curious enough to look. And on nights like this, when sleep beckons and consciousness softens, we can almost hear those stories, almost feel the presence of those who came before, almost understand what they endured so that we could have what we have. Let that understanding be gentle as you drift towards sleep. Let it be soft rather than heavy, comforting rather than disturbing. Let it remind you that you're part of a long chain of survival, that you exist because countless others survived impossible things. The winter of 1846 is over, has been over for nearly 2 centuries. The people who suffered through it are long dead, their struggles ended, their stories told as many times as they'll be told. The mountain still stands, patient and eternal, caring nothing for human drama. But the story lives on in us, carried forward through telling and retelling. Changed slightly with each generation, but essentially the same. A reminder that we're all more fragile and more resilient than we imagine. That civilization is thinner than we pretend. That survival is both harder and simpler than we think. So sleep now if sleep will come. Let the story fade into dreams where its edges soften and its horror becomes bearable. Let history become lullaby, the past becoming a path toward rest rather than restlessness. The snow falls in your imagination now, gentle and clean, covering everything equally. The cabins disappear beneath white. The trail vanishes. The whole terrible landscape becomes smooth and new, as if nothing bad ever happened there. And maybe that's what sleep is, a kind of snow that covers everything, that gives us rest from remembering, that lets us wake tomorrow to a world made new. A small death and resurrection every night, proof that endings can lead to beginnings, that darkness can give way to light. The rhythm of your breathing slows, matching the gentle fall of imaginary snow. Your thoughts grow quiet, muffled by the soft accumulation of approaching sleep. Your body grows heavy, sinking into comfort the way snow sinks into drifts, natural and inevitable. Somewhere in the Sierra Nevada, the real snow falls on the real mountain, covering the real ground where real people really suffered and really died. But that's far away now, separated from you by miles and years and the warm safety of the present moment. You don't need to hold their suffering anymore tonight. You've witnessed it, honored it, remembered it. That's enough. Now you can let it go, can release the past back to the past where it belongs, can return to your own time and your own comfort. The story is told, the journey is complete. The winter has ended as all winters end, with spring and warmth and the resumption of life. The survivors survived, the lost are mourned, the lessons are learned and recorded and passed down, and you, warm and safe and drifting towards sleep, are the beneficiary of all that struggle. You exist in the world their suffering helped create. You enjoy the comfort their endurance purchased. You rest easy because they endured unease. So rest now, deeply, peacefully, completely. Let sleep take you gently into darkness that promises light on the other side. Let consciousness fade like footprints in new snow, disappearing but not gone, just waiting to be rediscovered when morning comes. The mountains stand eternal in the darkness, patient as they've always been. The snow falls as it's fallen for millennia, indifferent to human stories. The past remains past, unable to hurt you, only to teach you, only to remind you of how lucky you are to be here, now, in this moment of safety. And in the morning, if you remember this story at all, let it make you grateful. For small things and large things, for warmth and food and safety, for the ordinary miracles that we only notice when we imagine living without them. But that's tomorrow's thought. Tonight, there's only this moment, this breath, this gentle descent into sleep, this quiet end to a long journey through time and snow and stories that needed telling. Sleep well, traveler through time. Dream of warmth, and know that the winter, however long and dark and cold, always eventually ends, always gives way to spring. always releases its grip and lets life continue. The Donner Party's winter ended. Yours will too when it comes, and until then you have this warmth, this comfort, this safe passage through the night. You have the simple gift of not having to endure what they endured, the simple blessing of living in a time when survival is assumed rather than achieved. So drift now, let go, release, surrender to sleep as the snow surrenders to spring, as night surrenders to day, as struggle surrenders to peace. Let the story end here, in this warm darkness, in this quiet space between waking and sleep. The tale is told, the journey is done, the winter is over, and you, warm and safe and barely conscious now, can rest in the knowledge that some struggles end, some suffering stops, some stories have conclusions that allow for peace. Good night, traveler. Sleep deeply, and may your dreams be warm and your rest be complete. The mountains will still be there tomorrow, still holding their stories, still waiting to remind us of where we came from and what we've survived. But tonight, they're just mountains. The snow is just snow. And you are just someone drifting peacefully towards sleep, carried on the gentle current of a story well told, a journey safely completed, a past safely left in the past where it belongs. Rest now, the story is over, the night is here, and sleep like spring after winter comes eventually to everyone who waits for it with patience and peace.